Hi there, this is Evan Sanchez with Springboard Consulting, joining you today with Chris Bowen. I contacted Chris over the summer when we were doing a study on sales champs and those people who have been working from home or work from anywhere environment prior to COVID-19. We wanted to apply some new findings in neuroscience to take a look at their thinking and identify and even build a template to help people look like a champ, sell like a champ, act like a champ, just be a champ in general. And my next guest, Chris Bowen, was one of the top performers. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because he was not only one of the top performers and had some of the most powerful performance drivers and lower barrier thinking scores, but he also had a very low anxiety outcome score. So Chris, you got to tell us some secrets, man. I know you've got a tough industry that you work in. What's going on in your industry, and how are you able to sustain performance in such a tough environment?
Well, I think the first part is understanding why you're working, right? What are you trying to accomplish? How are you going to make your customers, clients' lives better, right? If you have an understanding of how that's going to happen, it helps you a whole lot. The second thing is also I try to make sure that we're we're focused on solving the pain, right? Just because I have a desire to generate revenue does not necessarily mean that the pain that I solve is going to be the pain that my customer either has or realizes they have. So a lot of times you may have to be teaching them, educating them up front, identifying the pain, showing a better path. It gets out of the whole "this is the way we've always done it" sort of paradigm. Um,
They
if
don't
you
know what
don't
they
do
don't know kind of thing, huh?
That's right. Well, yeah, that and it depends on the industry you're selling into. Obviously, I think in 2020, because of COVID and everything else, you've had organizations have to scramble quite a bit. And so I think forcing them to own up to some of those challenges that they may have had, but were able to still sort of brute force their way through prior to this year, is going to change the way they operate going forward. So understanding that and being able to say, okay, well, now that you're doing this, now that you have a much more distributed workforce, what types of problems, what types of challenges does that sort of inject into your organization that didn't exist before? I'm not one of these people that seems to think, and I've had this conversation a bunch, that we've now entered a case of pure remote work forever. Um, and I think certainly getting a vaccine or something along those lines is gonna be critical. But the main thing is eventually work's going to go back to fairly close to the way it was. You may have organizations that now offer remote as a byproduct or as a partial sort of option for people. Maybe they can do it 2 days a week or things along those lines. But I don't think you're going to see it be 100% all the time ever again after this is over.
Yeah, I think it forced a lot of people to adopt the technologies and the systems and the tools that maybe they had on deck, and maybe you had a lower level of adoption. And when it went to a must-have versus a like-to-have, it really sped up a lot of things. So
I think
since
that
you were
I think
already
early
used to
on,
it,
I
go
think
ahead.
early on you saw this. I think early on you saw this thing where um, people were saying, "Oh, we're not seeing an impact on our productivity at all, right? Or we're seeing increases in productivity." And I think it depends on how they're measuring it, right? If you're measuring it per hour worked, I would be willing to bet you're not seeing an uptick in productivity. You may be seeing more net counting of that productivity because people were working longer hours, and a good portion of that was because they didn't have a basis um, for how to start up and close down their day working from home typically. So in the old world, they would have had a car ride and ride, even if it was a walk. Um, and that allowed them to transition into work. And then they were able to reverse that at the end of the day and transition out of work. When they were home, they didn't have any of those things in place. So they just ended up, while they may have taken different types of breaks during the day to deal with kids, pets, whatever they may not have normally done in the past, they had to. they now have to transition that to where they were extending that workday. Probably, I would guess in some ways, probably in a non-optimal way, right? Like working 10 or 12 or 14 hours without really realizing it because not having those routines in place. I think you're going to see where, as you got closer to Q3 and Q4, you'll see those numbers start to become more realistic because people have had to adapt. They could do it for the short term, but for the long term, it just wouldn't work.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely saw a lot of higher anxiety scores in the people that we did the study with. And like I said, I think your awareness of having those rhythms and those things in place and kind of being used to it, I could see how that would be a huge advantage for you. What do you think you were able to do, or what part of your mindset was, allowed you to kind of continue that through while we transitioned into the pandemic? And while everybody was going through this, you seem to have a very good handle on it moving through.
I think that may end up hitting a little bit more of my personality and things along those lines. I tend to look at most things from a situational perspective as to whether or not I have any level of control or influence in the situation, right?
Right.
If I don't, then I don't worry about it because there's nothing I can do, right?
Yeah.
If I have influence but no control, then I try to break that down and try to understand what is it that I can influence there. It may be a very small piece, it may be a big piece, but whatever it is that I'm able to influence, and is that going to get to a better outcome for me, or a better outcome for the company, or a better outcome for my client, whatever the focus is, right? So that's how I tend to break those things down. If it ends up being something where it's going to be a lot of effort for not much bang of the buck, then I tend to also jettison those things because it's not worth the effort. On those things that I can control, that's where I want to spend the bulk of my time. Like I can control how I show up. I can control how I've time blocked my calendar as long as I stay consistent with it. Right? If those things break down and I'm not devoting the amount of time that I would do to certain types of activities in sales, let's say normally I devote 20% of my week to prospecting.
Right.
And maybe I do that all in one day. Maybe I break it up over the course of multiple days, however I do it. If I allow other things to insert themselves into that time that I've already blocked for that, and I don't make it up later in the week, it starts to become a negative impact, right? So it's maintaining those things and understanding what you're really working on and how those things contribute to the end goal. At least that's how I've always looked at it. I don't know if other people tend to break their work up quite that way, but that's the method that has worked for me, at least in the past 5-10 years.
I think certified sales champs like yourself definitely do that, right? The biggest thing that I see most of the time when people are, working from a project management standpoint, or they do have the discipline to at least time block a lot of their activities, is actually then doing it. Do they have the discipline to stay on that? And what I hear you saying is, if you don't control that and you don't understand that and you let things creep in and come around, that's going to help build up anxiety. That's going to help build up that stress. So you have a very good handle on that situational awareness, and that's kind of what has allowed you to stay focused during those times of uncertainty.
I think so. Yeah, I think you have to be able to, like I said, if you allow something to overlap with that time that you would normally leverage, you've got to replace it somewhere, right? And what I think that forces you to do is understand the trade-offs. If I say I'm going to pull an hour out of whatever time I originally had blocked for prospecting, and I don't make it up that week, guarantee you're going to see a hit, right? Somewhere down the line, depending on what your sales cycle is. If your sales cycle is 6-9 months, or 3-6 months, 2-3 weeks, whatever it be, you're going to fill that hit over that period of time. You do that enough, and next thing you know, you've got nothing from a pipeline, nothing from a backlog perspective to be able to work towards.
Absolutely. It sneaks up on you one way or another, that's for sure.
Yeah. It's sort of like the, I can't remember where I heard it, but it was a comment around going broke. It's like, how did you go broke? Gradually and then all at once, right?
Yeah, it just kind of snuck up on them. Yeah, right.
That's right.
So when you were going through, the ThinkX diagnostic results with your coach, I know it was a while back, was there any big aha that you had that maybe you were like, huh, I didn't know that about me, that ThinkX profile was able to pull out?
Yeah, the two areas that I thought were the biggest surprise to me were the need for reassurance and the self defeat. Um, while I don't think I tend to have a whole lot of self defeat, and that's what it showed, I thought there would have been a little bit higher than a six on that, and the need for self assurance I thought would have been much higher. Like I don't have a high need for self assurance, but I wouldn't, but it's not zero, right? Like
Yeah, you didn't
uh,
even need a pat on the back. You didn't need anything. You were good.
I don't tend, I don't, and that's that part that I found really interesting. Like I, I know that I know I tend to do good work, but I also do ask after every customer interaction, sales meetings that I've ran, things like that. What are the things I could do better? What are the things that I'm missing? What would you need to see in order for this to be more effective for you? Um, I look at that no different than I would sales, right? Like it's how do I make my interactions with my team give them the most value least amount of time, because all the time that I pull out is ultimately pulling away from their selling effort. So I need to be able to make sure that I'm adding value that's significantly above what else they could be doing. And so, and when you have a large sales team, you're going to have a lot of different inputs there, right? And so if you're really going to care about your people, maybe you only end up with 10% that have a particular thing they would really like to see. And while I realize 90% of the people may not want to see that, at some point you're probably going to have to address that, right? Because you don't want to alienate your team unless it's just bottom performers that aren't getting that piece, and you're not able to coach them and everything else. My guess is those people are on their way to a new career. Um, Maybe they're just in the wrong job focus. A lot of people come into sales looking at the rewards, and not really understanding the work that it takes.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely have to be conscious of, not just what your needs are, but what the needs are of others. And like you're saying, you're going to have to meet those at some point, even if they're not a large need of yours. And,
Right.
I think
Well,
that's
even if
kind
they're
of
not a
what
large need.
ThinkX does, right? It tells you, hey, this is something that you may not have known about yourself. And now you have a situational awareness that you can bring into working with other people.
Correct.
So, as you've worked with other people and been a high performer yourself and worked within high performance teams, do you think that utilizing the ThinkX diagnostic with a team or in a work environment would bring new insights that you could utilize as a sales leader?
Absolutely, brought new insights to me. So, and that was with things that I absolutely were not expecting. And I've done a number of different diagnostics, over the year, whether you're talking about Myers Briggs or DISC and or PI and things along those lines. So,
Yeah, definitely. That's kind of the way that I was with it too. I've done and trained certified facilitator in many of the behavioral tools, and for me personally, when I went through it, it helped me identify where, I had these competing priorities, if you will, and I had
right,
these two competing things going on in my mind that I wasn't even completely aware of, and that being, high levels of control, high levels of skepticism, but at the same time I was highly confident and I was highly ambitious. And so, understanding that I could switch back and forth from those, and one of those created more anxiety than the other, it made me choose the other, right? Because if I'm going to get better performance for it and lower my anxieties, I'm going to be a better performer overall and probably a better husband and a father and, teammate.
sure. Which is one of the things I think people don't think about quite enough, right? Like when you look at your work life in general, um, the space that takes up, mentally, emotionally, physically, um, is a lot bigger than 9 to 5, right? Because even if that was your work schedule, which I've never really had a 9 to 5, I tend to work on both sides of that.
Yeah,
Continuum.
welcome to sales.
Right. But it's also the mental time that takes up and the mental space that it takes up well beyond those periods. And so if you're not, if you're going in and you're used to a job where, hey, when I'm off work, I'm off work, then there's plenty of places that work for you. Being in the enterprise space from a sales perspective is not one of them, because you don't have 100% control. You also don't have 100% of where the problems are going to come. And so, it tends to take up a lot of space. I also tend to try to devote the majority of my workday to sales activities that are moving things forward, and then I try to carve out, usually 30 minutes to an hour of time later in the day to update CRM, and try to do that every day.
Yeah.
At various points, I've tried to do other things, like I'll update it once a week. Found it to be a disaster, right? For me, it works best to update it daily. Gets me closer to the time when I had the conversations, and it makes it easier for me to input my notes. If I can do it real time, then I'll do that. But I've worked in different places. Sometimes we have tools that record conversations, record your phone calls, record all those types of things. But I've also been in places where it's all brute force effort, and so it sort of depends on what your mechanism for that stuff is. But I still would, even in the places where it's automated, I would still go back in and review it, make sure that it had the right context and everything else if I needed to add any additional notes, because not everything's going to come across from just conversation.
I totally agree, and I think that's where, having these systems as tools to assist really come into play. But also, going back to the earlier part of our conversation around the fact that when people started working from home more, they didn't have these rituals, they didn't have these rhythms in place. And now when you have a significant other, or you have your children, or you have something else that's vying for your attention in your new work from home environment, you were already used to that environment. You already had these systems in place. And so you just kind of plugged back into business as usual.
Yeah, but I think I've also seen things where people that aren't used to that, it creates a different type of challenge. And our oldest was a sophomore in college this year, right? So freshman in college last year, going sophomore starting this year, and so she's older. She's at school, so the less of a critical impact there, right? The youngest is going to be 12 this year. So when you switch to homeschooling and they're home all the time, it's not. I think it takes on a different type of rationale than just an extended summer vacation, right?
Oh yeah, it was a total shock for everybody. Well, hey, Chris.
Kids don't understand that stuff. So
No, they don't, and that's why you got to make time for them, right? And you got to be able to be flexible, but with those systems and things in place, you can stay on track. I want to thank you again, Chris, for participating in the study with ThinkX. I want to thank you for your time today, and I wish you and your family the best 2020 and an even better 2021 coming up. Thank you again so much for your time. Have a great day.